Iran's air force has been sitting in ruins since almost the very first hour of this war. And if you actually go back and look at exactly what happened in those opening days, the scale of what got destroyed is genuinely staggering. F-4 Phantoms burned on the runway before they ever got airborne. Su-22 ground attack jets turned into wreckage inside their own hangars. An entire Shahed drone depot wiped off the map in a single strike. This wasn't a gradual campaign that slowly ground down Iran's air power over months. This was a systematic opening night dismantling of an entire air force, carried out with such speed and such precision that within the first week of this war, Iran's ability to put a fighter jet into the sky and actually contest American or Israeli airspace had been reduced to almost nothing. So let's walk through exactly how the United States military went about unleashing this level of destruction on Iran's air force, what got hit, what it actually meant strategically, and why some of the wreckage in this story is a lot more complicated than the headlines initially made it sound. To understand the scale of what happened here, you have to go back to the opening night of this war, February 28th, when coordinated American and Israeli strikes hit Iranian military and political targets across the entire country simultaneously. In the middle of that opening wave, before Iran's air defense network had even fully processed what was happening, Israeli strikes hit Tabriz airport and caught an Iranian F-4 Phantom sitting on the runway, preparing for takeoff, and destroyed it right there before it ever left the ground. That single strike tells you almost everything you need to know about the strategic logic driving this entire campaign from the very first minutes of the war. You don't wait for the enemy's fighters to get airborne and become a genuine threat in the sky. You catch them exactly where they're most vulnerable, sitting on a runway, fueled and armed and completely exposed, and you eliminate them before they ever have the chance to become a problem for your own pilots. And that opening strike was just the beginning of a systematic campaign that unfolded across the following days with remarkable speed. On March 1st, United States Central Command released footage on its official social media account documenting a series of precision strikes against multiple Iranian air bases, part of the broader campaign that's now officially referred to as Operation Epic Fury. That footage, later analyzed frame by frame by defense analysts, confirmed the destruction of Iranian F-4D and F-4E Phantom fighters, Su-22 ground attack aircraft, and critically, a storage depot specifically holding Shahed 136 loitering munitions, the exact same long-range attack drones Iran has relied on so heavily throughout this entire war to harass shipping and strike at American and Allied positions across the region. American defense officials were explicit about the reasoning behind these specific targeting choices, describing the strikes as a deliberate effort to degrade operational capability, not a symbolic show of force. In other words, this wasn't about sending a message. This was about physically removing Iran's ability to generate both conventional fighter sorties and long-range drone strikes in one coordinated blow. The scale of that first wave becomes even clearer once you look at what happened just a few days later, on March 5th, when Central Command released a second round of strike footage, this time documenting what officials described in blunt terms: the Iranian regime's ability to impact American forces and regional partners rapidly declining while American combat power continued to build. That footage showed strikes against a genuinely wide mix of aircraft, a Northrop F-5 Tiger, a Su-24 Fencer, and what analysts believed was either a Yak-130 trainer or a Su-25 ground attack jet, all caught on the ground and destroyed in place. Open-source intelligence trackers working to independently verify every confirmed loss throughout this war have compiled lists showing visually confirmed destruction across a huge range of Iranian airframes: 2 F-5s, an F-4, 2 Su-24 Fencers, a Yak-130, and half a dozen additional unidentified fighter jets, all destroyed within just the opening week of this conflict. One tracking site monitoring verified military losses across the entire war has documented a running total north of 140 confirmed aircraft losses for Iran specifically, a number that continues climbing as analysts work through additional satellite imagery and strike footage. Now here's where the story gets genuinely interesting, and where it's worth slowing down and giving you the honest, complete picture rather than just repeating the most dramatic version of these headlines, because a significant piece of this destruction turned out to be considerably more complicated than it first appeared. Open-source analysts, specifically an account called Evergreen Intel that's been closely tracking this conflict through satellite imagery, dug into the specific aircraft destroyed in some of these strikes and found something worth noting. Several of the airframes hit, including a group of Fokker F-27 turboprop aircraft belonging to companies called Karun Air and Naft Air, were confirmed derelict, meaning satellite photos showed those exact aircraft sitting in the exact same position for years without moving. Clear evidence they weren't operational aircraft, posing any genuine military threat at all. The analysis specifically noted that the bulk of Iran's targeted airframes across this campaign were likely derelict as well, a pattern that had already shown up during Israel's earlier strikes on Iranian aircraft back in 2025, well before this current war even began. So what do you actually make of that? On one hand, it's a genuinely important piece of context because it means some portion of the dramatic footage of Iranian jets exploding on the ground wasn't destroying combat-capable aircraft that posed a real threat to American or Allied pilots. It was destroying aging, non-flying airframes that had likely been sitting abandoned on runways and in hangars for years already. That distinction matters if you're trying to accurately assess how much of Iran's actual operational air power got eliminated versus how much of the footage was simply visually dramatic without representing a proportional strategic impact. But on the other hand, there's a legitimate military logic even to destroying derelict aircraft in a war like this one, and it's worth understanding both sides of that argument rather than just dismissing the strikes as empty theater. Even a non-flying airframe can potentially be cannibalized for spare parts to keep other, still functional aircraft flying. Even a derelict aircraft parked on a runway can, in theory, be repaired or restored to some degree of usefulness, given enough time and enough access to replacement components, something Iran, under crushing international sanctions for decades, has had a well-documented history of doing with its aging fleet of mostly pre-revolution-era American aircraft and Soviet-era imports. Destroying that stockpile denies Iran even that marginal option going forward. And given how badly Iran's total inventory of genuinely airworthy combat aircraft has been degraded by decades of sanctions, preventing new purchases or replacement parts, removing even the derelict backup inventory carries real strategic weight for a country that simply cannot replace what it loses, the way a wealthier, less isolated military power could. And crucially, not every aircraft destroyed in this campaign fits that derelict category, which is exactly why it's important not to overcorrect in the other direction either and dismiss the entire campaign as symbolic. That very same March 5th CENTCOM footage showing the F-5, according to Evergreen Intel's own analysis cross-referencing satellite imagery, appeared to actually be operational, since it hadn't been sitting in that specific location in earlier satellite photos, suggesting it had been actively moved and positioned there sometime after the war began, exactly the kind of behavior you'd expect from a functioning aircraft rather than an abandoned hulk. And beyond that opening week's footage, the broader pattern of confirmed losses across this war includes plenty of genuinely combat-relevant destruction. 2 Su-24 Fencers, a legitimate Soviet-era strike aircraft still used by Iran for ground attack missions, were intercepted and shot down in actual air-to-air combat by Qatari F-15QA fighters just minutes from Al Udeid Air Base, marking the first confirmed air-to-air kills for that specific Qatari fighter variant. That's not a derelict aircraft caught sleeping on a runway. That's a functioning combat jet, airborne, engaged, and shot down in a genuine aerial engagement, which tells you Iran did still have at least some meaningful portion of its air force attempting to fly real missions during this opening stretch of the war, even as its overall capability was collapsing around it. Let's talk about Shiraz specifically, because the strike on Shahed Dastgaib International Airport, a dual-use civilian and military facility, represents one of the more significant single blows against Iran's broader aviation infrastructure throughout this entire campaign. According to initial reporting, the strike there destroyed 5 separate IRIF aircraft, including a single Ilyushin Il-76 strategic transport, 2 C-130 Hercules transport aircraft, and 2 Su-22 fighter bombers, all of it targeted while parked inside a hangar, which required precise, high-accuracy munitions to hit effectively rather than the kind of broad-area bombing that might have simply leveled the entire structure without necessarily guaranteeing the aircraft inside were destroyed. Think about the strategic value of specifically going after transport aircraft in a moment like this, because it's easy to focus entirely on fighter jets when talking about an air force getting destroyed, but transport capability matters just as much in a sustained war. The Il-76 and the C-130 aren't combat aircraft in the traditional sense, but they're the backbone of how a military actually moves personnel, equipment, and supplies quickly across a large country into regional partners and proxies beyond its own borders. Destroying that transport capability alongside the strike aircraft parked in the same hangar meaningfully degrades Iran's ability to reposition forces and resupply operations across multiple fronts simultaneously. Exactly the kind of logistics strangling that compounds the damage of losing combat aircraft outright. Now let's talk about why Iran's Air Force was such a comparatively soft target in the first place, because understanding that context helps explain why this campaign was able to move so fast and inflict so much damage in such a short window of time. Iran's Air Force has been operating under crushing sanctions since decades before this war ever started. Sanctions that have made it extraordinarily difficult for the country to purchase new fighter aircraft, acquire spare parts for its existing fleet, or maintain the kind of modern, well-supported air force that a country of Iran's size and regional ambitions might otherwise have built. That's exactly why so much of Iran's inventory, even the aircraft that were still technically operational going into this war, consisted of genuinely ancient airframes, F-4 Phantoms and F-5 Tigers, that trace their design lineage back to American aircraft from the 1960s, purchased before the 1979 revolution, and kept limping along for decades, since through improvised maintenance and parts cannibalization. Add in Soviet-era imports like the Su-22 and Su-24, themselves increasingly outdated relative to modern Western fighter technology, and you're looking at an Air Force that, even before a single American or Israeli bomb fell, was already decades behind the kind of fifth-generation stealth aircraft and networked precision strike capability that the coalition arrayed against it was bringing to this fight. That gap in raw technological capability is a huge part of why this campaign was able to move as fast and as decisively as it did. You weren't watching two evenly matched air forces slug it out over contested airspace. You were watching a modern, networked, precision-guided coalition systematically dismantling an air force that had effectively been frozen in technological time for decades by international isolation. But it would be a mistake to conclude from all of this that Iran simply rolled over and offered no resistance in the air throughout this campaign, because that's not entirely accurate either, and it's worth giving credit to the honest complexity of what actually happened, rather than flattening this into a purely one-sided story. There was, in fact, a documented friendly fire incident during this exact stretch of fighting that tells you something important about just how chaotic and dangerous this opening phase of the air campaign actually was for everyone involved, including the coalition's own pilots. On March 2nd, a United States Air Force F-15E Strike Eagle was shot down over Kuwait. Not by an Iranian missile, but by a Kuwaiti F-A-18 Hornet in a friendly fire incident during the opening days of Operation Epic Fury, the aircraft's crew ejecting safely. That kind of incident, a coalition partner's own fighter mistakenly engaging and shooting down an American aircraft, underscores just how confused, fast-moving, and genuinely dangerous the airspace over this region became once this war kicked off, with multiple air forces from multiple countries all flying combat sorties simultaneously across an incredibly compressed and contested stretch of sky. And Iran didn't simply absorb this level of destruction without attempting to strike back either. Even as its air force was being systematically dismantled on the ground, Iran launched a significant wave of retaliatory strikes against American and Allied positions across the wider region, hitting targets in Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman in the days immediately following the war's opening strikes. In Kuwait specifically, Iranian drones struck Kuwait International Airport and the Ali al-Salem Air Base, which hosts Italian forces, while another drone hit the American garrison at Camp Buehring in the northeast of the country. Later press research, revealed only in late April, uncovered something genuinely remarkable buried in that specific engagement, that an Iranian Air Force fighter jet, specifically a Northrop F-5, had actually managed to penetrate the multiple layered defenses surrounding Camp Buehring and conduct a successful bombing run against that American position. That single detail complicates the broader narrative in an important way. Even amid a campaign that was destroying Iran's air force at a staggering rate, at least one Iranian fighter managed to slip through and successfully strike an American target. A reminder that even a badly degraded, mostly grounded Air Force can still occasionally find a gap to exploit if the defending side isn't watching every single axis of approach with perfect coverage at all times. In total, across that specific engagement in Kuwait, coalition forces shot down 97 ballistic missiles and 283 drones, an enormous defensive effort that still came at a real cost. 7 soldiers killed and dozens wounded, alongside the loss of that F-15E in the friendly fire incident, a CH-47 Chinook helicopter destroyed, and 4 additional service members killed with 77 wounded in a separate portion of that same engagement. Those numbers matter because they're a reminder that even a campaign this dominant, this successful at grinding down an adversary's air force, doesn't come without genuine cost and genuine risk to the people actually flying and fighting on the American and Allied side of this conflict. Over in Oman, Iranian drone strikes targeting the port of Duqm and the port of Salalah, along with strikes on commercial oil tankers near Muscat and Kasab, resulted in the destruction of an American A-10 ground attack aircraft, with the pilot injured, alongside at least 19 Iranian drones successfully intercepted before they could do further damage. And in the United Arab Emirates, Iranian ballistic missile and drone attacks aimed primarily at American assets, and bases across the country ended up costing the lives of 3 foreign workers, a Pakistani, a Nepali, and a Bangladeshi national, with 58 others injured, a grim reminder that the human cost of these retaliatory strikes has often fallen hardest on migrant laborers with no connection whatsoever to the underlying conflict between Iran and the coalition arrayed against it. So, when you put the full picture together, what you're actually looking at is a war in the sky that was genuinely lopsided in terms of overall outcome, but far from bloodless or entirely one-sided in terms of actual engagements. Iran's Air Force, as a coherent, functioning fighting force capable of contesting airspace or mounting sustained offensive operations, was effectively shattered within the first week of this conflict. Dozens of aircraft destroyed on the ground and in the air, entire squadrons of aging Phantoms and Fencers and Tigers reduced to wreckage across multiple air bases simultaneously. But Iran's broader ability to strike back, through drones, through ballistic missiles, through the occasional aircraft that managed to slip through layered coalition defenses, remained genuinely dangerous throughout this same stretch, inflicting real casualties and real damage across Kuwait, the UAE, and Oman, even as its own conventional air power collapsed. That's the honest, complete shape of what happened here. Not a clean, one-sided story of total American dominance with zero cost, but a story of overwhelming decisive success against Iran's Air Force specifically, occurring simultaneously with genuine, costly fighting happening on multiple other fronts across the wider region. It's worth digging a bit deeper into exactly how this opening campaign was actually coordinated across multiple different national air forces simultaneously, because that coordination itself was a significant part of why Iran's own air force got overwhelmed so quickly. This wasn't purely an American operation. Israeli strikes hit to breeze in those opening hours. Qatari fighters, flying their newly acquired F-15QA variant, shot down Iranian Su-24s minutes from their own airbase. Kuwaiti forces, Italian forces stationed at Ali al-Salem, and American units were all operating simultaneously across a genuinely enormous stretch of contested airspace, spanning multiple countries at once. Coordinating that many different national air forces, each with their own command structures, their own rules of engagement, and their own specific equipment, into a single coherent campaign moving fast enough to catch an adversary's entire air force still sitting on the ground is an extraordinarily complex logistical and diplomatic achievement in its own right, well before you even get to the actual physical destruction of Iranian aircraft. That friendly fire incident involving the Kuwaiti Fa-18 and the American F-15E is actually a pretty vivid illustration of exactly how difficult that coordination problem really was in practice, even among close allies working from shared intelligence and shared objectives. When you're moving that many aircraft from that many different countries through the same contested airspace within the same compressed window of time, even close allies with excellent communication can end up making tragic mistakes. And that specific incident is a sober reminder that the overwhelming success of this campaign against Iran's Air Force didn't come without genuine friction and genuine risk, even on the coalition's own side of the fight. There's also a broader historical pattern worth understanding here, because this wasn't the first time Iran's aging fleet of aircraft had come under this exact kind of pressure. Israeli strikes back in 2025, during what's become known as the 12-Day War, had already targeted a number of Iranian aircraft, and analysts at the time noted the same pattern that would later repeat itself in this current conflict. A significant portion of the targeted airframes turning out to be derelict, non-flying aircraft that had been sitting unused for years. That earlier campaign, in Operation Midnight Hammer specifically, the strike against Iran's nuclear facilities at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan, using 14 GBU-57 bunker buster bombs dropped from B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, set an important precedent for exactly the kind of overwhelming, precision-guided opening strike doctrine that would later define the opening days of this much larger war back in February. Iran's response to that earlier 2025 campaign, launching missiles at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, with roughly half of them intercepted according to Qatari and American accounts, established a pattern of Iranian retaliation against regional American bases that we'd go on to see repeated at considerably larger scale in the Kuwait, UAE, and Oman strikes that followed the opening days of this current war. Understanding that 2025 precedent helps explain why this campaign against Iran's Air Force in 2026 moved with the speed and confidence that it did. Coalition planners weren't improvising a brand new strategy from scratch. They were executing a refined, tested version of a doctrine that had already been proven effective against many of these exact same target types less than a year earlier. Let's also talk about what all of this actually meant for Iran's broader deterrence posture heading into the rest of this war. Because an air force isn't just useful for offensive strikes. It's also one of the primary tools any modern military relies on to deter an adversary from taking certain actions in the first place, simply by maintaining the credible threat of being able to intercept and respond to incursions into your own airspace. Once that deterrent capability collapsed within the first week of this conflict, it fundamentally changed the risk calculation for every subsequent American and Israeli operation across Iranian territory for the rest of the war. Bombing runs against nuclear facilities, strikes against IRGC headquarters, the systematic targeting of missile storage bunkers along the coastline near the Strait of Hormuz, all of these later operations, which we've covered extensively in other breakdowns of this conflict, were able to proceed with dramatically reduced risk of Iranian fighters scrambling to intercept the aircraft carrying them out. That's an enormous, if less visually dramatic, consequence of what happened in those opening days. It's not just that dozens of Iranian aircraft got destroyed. It's that every single mission flown against Iran for the following 5 months of this war has operated in an environment fundamentally shaped by the fact that Iran lost its ability to meaningfully contest that airspace within the conflict's very first week. And that reduced risk profile has real measurable value beyond just the psychological comfort of coalition pilots. Every strike mission that doesn't have to account for the possibility of enemy fighters scrambling to intercept it can be planned with a different risk tolerance, potentially flying with lighter escort packages, committing fewer resources to suppression of enemy air defenses focused specifically on airborne threats, and generally operating with a level of freedom of movement through contested airspace that simply wouldn't be available against an adversary that retained even a modest functioning air force. Some analysts tracking this war have specifically pointed to this dynamic as part of why the coalition has been able to sustain such an intensive tempo of operations across so many different fronts simultaneously: the naval blockade, the tanker strikes, the ongoing hunt for fast boats, the sustained bombing campaign against missile and drone infrastructure, all running in parallel for months on end. Removing Iran's air force from the equation in week 1 didn't just win that specific battle, it fundamentally lowered the operational cost of nearly everything the coalition has done in this war ever since. Because the destruction of Iran's air force in those opening days didn't just matter as an isolated statistic. It fundamentally shaped everything that followed across the following months of this conflict. Every single strike we've covered in other breakdowns of this war, the bunker buster campaigns against Iran's nuclear sites, the sustained bombing runs against IRGC headquarters and missile storage facilities, the ongoing naval blockade, and the AC-130 gunships hunting fast boats over the Strait of Hormuz, all of that has been able to operate with a level of relative freedom of movement through Iranian airspace that would have been considerably more dangerous and considerably more costly if Iran had retained a functioning, contesting air force capable of intercepting coalition aircraft on a regular basis. Once you eliminate an adversary's ability to put fighters in the air to challenge your bombers and strike aircraft, every subsequent mission across the rest of the war becomes measurably safer and measurably more sustainable for your own pilots. That's really the core strategic logic behind why this specific campaign happened so early, so fast, and with such overwhelming force in the opening days of the conflict. You don't wait to deal with the enemy's air force later. You eliminate it first, before it can ever meaningfully interfere with everything else you're planning to do across the following months. And that logic tracks directly with the broader pattern we've seen across the rest of this war since those opening days. Iran's continued resistance throughout this conflict has come almost entirely through asymmetric means: missiles, drones, small boats, proxy militias, exactly the kind of cheap, dispersed, hard to fully eliminate tools that don't require a functioning conventional air force to employ. That shift wasn't a choice Iran made out of some strategic preference for asymmetric warfare over conventional combat. It was, in large part, a shift forced onto Tehran by the simple fact that its conventional air power had been so thoroughly destroyed in the war's opening week that continuing to rely on it as a primary tool of resistance simply stopped being a viable option. Every missile Iran has launched since, every drone that's targeted a tanker in the Strait of Hormuz, every fast boat that's tried to harass a passing warship, has been happening in a strategic environment specifically shaped by the fact that Iran lost its ability to contest the skies over its own country within the first 7 days of this entire war. If you're finding this kind of detailed breakdown genuinely useful, actually walking through the full, honest picture of what happened during this opening air campaign rather than just repeating the most dramatic headlines, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because understanding exactly how this war's early phases shaped everything that's happened since is genuinely important context for making sense of where things stand today. And there's a lot more of this kind of detailed military history still worth digging into. And if you've got questions about any of the specific aircraft we've talked about here, the difference between what made the F-5 or the Su-24 still combat relevant compared to those derelict Fokkers sitting untouched for years, or how Iran's Air Force ended up so far behind technologically in the first place, drop them in the comments, because there's a lot of genuinely fascinating detail buried in exactly how this specific piece of the war unfolded. Let's zoom out and think about what this entire episode tells us about how modern air campaigns actually get won in the opening days of a conflict between a technologically advanced coalition and a heavily sanctioned, isolated regional power. There's a reason military planners have consistently prioritized establishing air superiority as close to immediately as possible in virtually every major conflict of the last several decades, because everything else a modern military wants to accomplish: precision strikes against missile sites, naval operations to secure critical waterways, ground support for any eventual territorial operations, becomes exponentially safer and more sustainable once you've eliminated the enemy's ability to contest your aircraft in the skies above the battlefield. What happened to Iran's Air Force in the opening week of this war is a genuinely textbook example of that doctrine, executed about as thoroughly and as fast as it's possible to execute it against a modern nation-state, even one as large and as historically significant as Iran. Decades of sanctions had already left that Air Force technologically outmatched and severely under-resourced going into this fight, and the coalition arrayed against it moved with enough speed and enough precision in those opening days to make sure that gap never had a chance to narrow, catching aircraft on runways and hangars and wherever else they could be found before Iran ever had the opportunity to disperse, hide, or meaningfully protect what remained of its aging fleet. So where does this leave Iran's air power today, months removed from those devastating opening days? By every meaningful measure, it leaves Iran functioning as a country that no longer has a conventional air force capable of contesting its own skies in any serious way, forced instead to rely almost entirely on the asymmetric tools we've covered extensively across this entire war: missiles, drones, small boats, and proxy forces, none of which require the kind of trained fighter pilots and maintained aircraft that Iran simply doesn't have left in any meaningful quantity anymore. That reality has shaped every single subsequent phase of this conflict, from the naval blockade to the tanker interdiction campaign to the ongoing hunt for fast boats across the Strait of Hormuz, all of it happening in a strategic environment where the coalition arrayed against Iran doesn't have to worry about contesting Iranian fighter jets in the process. Do you think Iran ever manages to meaningfully rebuild any portion of this air power given the sanctions and isolation it's operating under? Or has this specific piece of Iran's military capability been permanently eliminated as a factor in how this war, and any future conflict involving Iran, actually gets fought going forward? Given the scale of what we've just walked through, entire squadrons destroyed within a single week, decades of sanctions already preventing meaningful modernization before this war even began, and no realistic path to acquiring modern replacement aircraft while those sanctions remain in place, it's genuinely hard to see a scenario where Iran rebuilds anything resembling a functioning conventional air force within the foreseeable future. Which likely means the asymmetric tools we've watched Iran lean on throughout the rest of this war aren't a temporary adaptation. They may well be the primary shape of Iranian military resistance for years to come. Let me know what you think down in the comments. And if you want to keep tracking exactly how the destruction of Iran's air force in these opening days continues to shape everything happening across the rest of this war, make sure you're subscribed, because this is genuinely one of the foundational stories of the entire conflict, and it's worth understanding fully as everything else continues to unfold.